Tensions between Russia and Japan are increasing day by day over the Kuril Islands, the Kuril Islands. As Russia and Japan both are very important for India's geopolitical, economical, and military interests. According to you, what should be India's stance on this issue? Interesting question. Um, so let's talk about the Kuril Island dispute. Yeah, um, that's a dispute that's been simmering for about, I don't know, 80 years, 80, almost 80 years. So let's talk about that. So I spoke about the Meiji Restoration just a second ago. Yeah, so during the Meiji era, even during the Tokugawa shogunate era, uh, Japan had started expanding in various directions. Yeah, and one of the directions it expanded was in the north. So Japan had, I believe, this island, the island of Sakhalin, which is now a Russian island, was once a Japanese island. At least the southern half of the island was under Japanese control, and all of the Kuril Islands in the 19th century were under Japanese control. The Kuril Islands are this chain of islands, all right? This here in the middle of the screen is the northernmost Japanese main island of Hokkaido, and north of the island of Hokkaido, we have this island here, Sakhalin Island, and over here we have the various Kuril Islands. As you can see, it's written here, Kuril Islands. And this goes on all the way up to here until the Kamchatka Peninsula, which is a Russian peninsula. Now, um, in the 19th century, the Japanese and the Russians had various agreements. At one point in time, Japan and Russia had decided to share control over the Sakhalin Island. The northern half would be Russian, the southern half would be Japanese. Yeah, the Russians too had a policy of expansionism. Yeah, Russia, obviously, as we know, the capital has been Moscow, but they expanded eastwards. They also had this policy of settler colonialism, and this entire Eurasian landmass that is currently part of Russia was all conquered by the Russians. The peoples who live here are not Russian people. They are essentially uh, Tungusic people, Tuvan people, Siberian people who have Turkic ethnicity, Mongolic ethnicity, and so on. Yeah, in the north you have the Ainu people who live in this region, especially in the who have historically lived in the Kuril Islands. So, in the middle of the 19th century, the Russians and Japanese shared Sakhalin Island, and there was an agreement which said that Japan could essentially take control of all the Kuril Islands up to the tip of the Kamchatka Peninsula. Yeah. So this situation stood for a very long time. And then the Russians expanded eastwards. They took over Manchuria, and they also took control of the port city of Dalian, which is currently part of China, and they established a major port of Vladivostok, which is right north of North Korea. Right now, during the Second World War, Japan, as we know, fought the United States and the Western allies, and eventually in 1945, uh, Japan was defeated. Japan was made to surrender after the twin atomic tests on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yes. So a couple of days after the atomic test on Hiroshima, the Soviets and the Japanese had a non-aggression or some kind of agreement, which was due to expire in 1946. In 1946, but at the end of the war, just before Japan surrenders in 1945 itself, the Soviets launched an invasion of the Kuril Island chain, just 2 days after the atomic test on Hiroshima, the American atomic test on Hiroshima. So the Japanese were reeling from this disaster, and a couple of days, just a few days later, there was another test on Nagasaki, and a week after Hiroshima, the Japanese had to surrender. While this was happening, the Soviets, they broke the non-aggression pact, that whatever treaty they had, and illegally invaded the Kuril Islands. And the Kuril Islands, the inhabitants were all Japanese. So the Soviets very rapidly came all the way south up to these islands. What is this island called? Kunashir. What is this one called? It's called Zelioni. This one is called Shikotan, and so on. So all these islands were taken, were captured, forcibly by the Soviets, and they expelled all the Japanese inhabitants and relocated them forcibly to the Japanese mainland. And then the Soviets settled Slavic peoples in these islands, in Sakhalin, in the Kuril Islands, mainly Russian and Ukrainian speakers. Yeah. Um, so one could argue that the Soviet invasion of the Kuril Islands was illegal because they had this pact, this non-aggression or whatever pact it was, a peace pact, a peace treaty or whatever which was supposed to last until 1946. So the Japanese had been, they were defeated. The Soviets invaded these islands, etc. Then the Americans imposed certain treaties on the Japanese. The Japanese were forced to sign these treaties. One of these treaties says that the Japanese will relinquish all claims on the Kuril Islands. Yeah, that's one of the treaties, and various other things as well. As a consequence of all of these things that happened, the Japanese have always claimed that the Kuril Islands are the four Kuril Islands up to I believe the island of Urup. If not this one, then up to the island of Iturup. So they claim four Kuril Islands, and they said that these islands have been captured illegally by the Soviet Union, and now Russia is the continuation of the Soviet Union. And as a consequence of that, Japan and the USSR never signed a ceasefire, which means that technically World War II is still not over, because the ceasefire between Japan and the USSR was never signed, and the ceasefire between Japan and Russia has also never been signed. So the Russians, Soviets and now Russians, they have typically offered Japan control of two islands, two small islands. They said that we will offer you these two islands, and in exchange, you need to relinquish your claims on all the other islands. And the Japanese have steadfastly refused. That's the situation in the Kuril Islands. Now, why is it that these islands are so important? Why is Russia hanging on to these islands, which seem to be small and unimportant? It's the same kind of question I get from some people, that what's the big deal about Nehru relinquishing Aksai Chin? What's the big deal? It's just a small piece of territory where nothing grows. That's the kind of silly argument some people make. So understand that every inch of territory has strategic value, and I'll show you why. So the Russians, the Soviet Union, and today Russia. See, earlier Soviets had the Russians had access to Dalian port. Dalian is kind of to the south, which means that it doesn't freeze in the winter. If you see Vladivostok, the port of Vladivostok, which is the southernmost port in this region that the Russians have, it freezes in winter for at least 2 or 3 months. I don't remember how much, but it freezes totally. It's icebound in winter. So the Russian Pacific Fleet, it is based in the vicinity of Vladivostok. Yeah. So for the Russian Pacific Fleet to navigate the oceans, in winter it's quite difficult, and for this Russian Pacific Fleet, to go into the high seas of the Pacific Ocean, it has to go through several choke points. Let me show you what choke points exist. You have the island of Tsushima here. So there is the Korean Strait to the west of Tsushima. There is a different a strait to the right, to the east of Tsushima. There is a small strait over here between these islands in Japan. So South Korea is militarily occupied by the US. Japan is under permanent military occupation, tens of thousands of US troops in both the nations. So these straits are under constant surveillance by the Americans. So anything that happens here, the Americans will know immediately. So if the Soviet or later Russian fleet were to try to go into the Pacific Ocean from here, the Americans will know exactly what's happening, and that's not an ideal situation. The other straight choke point is here between Hokkaido and the main island of Japan. That also is obviously under constant US supervision. The other strait is between Sakhalin and Hokkaido, which is kind of something that the Russians can use. And then you have the Kuril Islands. Now, if the Kuril Islands were to go back into Japanese control, it means the Americans will immediately establish military bases there, and then they will be able to monitor everything the Russians are doing. Now, if you go to the northern Kuril Islands, these are very strongly icebound in winter. Even the southern Kuril Islands are icebound, but the northern islands are icebound for at least 2 months more. So that's why the Kuril Islands are strategically very important. If the Americans if the Japanese, which means the Americans, take control of these islands, then the entire Russian Pacific fleet will be totally hemmed in. It's like the island China, the island chains that the Chinese are so upset about. These island chains ring fence the Chinese navy, and the Americans are able to monitor everything the Chinese do as a consequence. Yeah, so that's why the Kuril Islands are so strategically important for the Russians. Of course, there's also the question of oil and gas. If you see Sakhalin, uh, the northeast part of Sakhalin, offshore, has very significant reserves of oil and natural gas. Yeah, very major reserves of oil and natural gas. It's possible that the Kuril Islands also may have significant reserves of oil and natural gas. So why should the Russians give that up? So that is the dispute. That's what the dispute is all about. And after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Japanese have been upping the ante and making these noises that Kuril Islands is a disputed territory and we want it back. Obviously, at the instigation of the US. And I would say that, i- if you look at the way history has unfolded, one could say that Japan has a very strong claim and a rightful claim on the Kuril Islands. But justice, there is no such thing as justice. Yeah, in geopolitics, whoever holds the islands is the rightful owner. That's how it goes. Might is right. So the Russians have military uh, a significant military presence on these islands. Yeah, they have anti-aircraft batteries. They have missiles that are installed over here, missile systems, um, troops as well over here. And there is a significant Russian and Ukrainian speaking population that has been settled in these islands. So the Russians are not going anywhere. They are not going to give up the claim, and they're not going to give up the islands. And there's not much the Japanese can do right now, as long as the Russians have the military strength and the capabilities to hold on to these islands. And these are very vital and strategically important islands for Russia. So why would they give it up? Now the question, so that's the Kuril Islands dispute. Now Russia and Japan both are important to India in various ways. What should India's stance be on the issue? India's stance should be, it's not our concern, it's not our business. Both nations should find a peaceful resolution to the debate, to the issue. You need to India would say that Japan and Russia should sit down and negotiate it and find a diplomatically negotiated solution to the disputed uh, Kuril Islands issue. No war, please don't go to war. This is not an era for war. That's what we say. So that should be India's stance on this issue. Japan essentially is an extension of the US. It really, it's very unfortunate that the wonderful people of Japan are under foreign military occupation for the past almost 80 years. It's terrible for them. Yeah. But yeah, Japan, as of today, is an extension of the US. It's a US vassal state. It's under total, almost total permanent US military occupation. Um, so, yes, Japan obviously has significant importance for India. Culturally, we have the very old relationship between India and Japan, and so culturally we are very much alike. Of course, Japan now doesn't have an independent foreign or military policy, so whatever they do is essentially what the Americans tell them to do. So that's how it is. So India should stay out of these disputes. It's not India's business. We should exhort both sides to refrain from any warmongering, any violence, and both sides need to sit down at the negotiating table and find a negotiated settlement or solution uh, to this dispute. That should be India's official position on the matter.